Wendell Berry is a prolific author, one of the great thinkers of the last century, and yet one of the most fascinating pieces about Wendell Berry's story is that he never left the small town, the small farm upon which he spent his whole life. People coaxed him to spend time at the great universities, to teach in the centers of power, but he refused, knowing that for him, the wilderness, his wilderness, was the source of his life, love, and energy. And reading from a poem by Wendell Berry, I wonder if we might find wisdom in his love and retreat to the wilderness. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's life might be, I go and I lie down where the wood drake rests his beauty on the water, where the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. And for a time, I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free. I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free. The wilderness is not a place many of us go willingly. When Jim Gaffney got married, his wife told him that it was part of her family's tradition to go camping. And he replied, "It's part of every family's tradition until they built houses." I've heard it said that camping is donating blood, one mosquito at a time, and sleeping bags are soft tacos on the Bears menu. And the way that Luke tells the story, you'd think he agrees. The wilderness, he says, is the stomping ground of the tempter. If you don't keep your wits about you, you can lose your way and never, never come home. 40 days of endless hunger, disturbing thoughts and temptations, with the devil as your constant companion. This is the worst marketing campaign ever. Who would willingly sign up for this? Which is perhaps why Lent is so difficult for us Christians to embrace. We all want to feel closer to God, but 40 days of making space for our thoughts to hound us? I mean, most of us can't even meditate for 4 minutes before we hear something really uncomfortable. So we sacrifice Starbucks and Facebook, hoping it might alleviate the guilt of knowing that we've never been any good at following Christ into the season of Lent. At the end of this journey, we know there is a cross waiting for us. And what we're less sure about is whether God thinks our pitiful lives are worth resurrecting. Truth be told, most of us give up on the wilderness for Lent, and we choose the detour. We still wind up at Calvary, but we've shed a lot less blood, a lot less sweat, a lot less tears to get there, which is a shame, really. Because when God's Spirit grabs you by the elbow and invites you into the wilderness, you can be sure it'll be worth your while. C.S. Lewis tells a story about his wife, Joy, who was haunted one morning as she went about her daily work by the obscure sense that God was at her elbow, demanding, tugging for her attention. And not being a perfected saint, she had the feeling that it would be a question of some unrepented sin or some tedious duty that God wanted her to perform, so she persisted in ignoring God. And at last, when she gave in, the message she got was, "I want to give you something." And she entered into the most profound state of joy. In 2002, the life I had built for myself fell apart. My marriage was over. I hated my career. I was struggling with a significant health issue while trying to be a good single parent. And I began to cast about for many spiritual traditions, looking for a way forward that didn't include feeling trapped in a life I didn't want and didn't feel like I'd chosen. And one night, sitting around a fire with a friend who had offered us a pipe ceremony, I heard a voice in my head say, "Go on a vision quest." Well, I had no idea at that time what a vision quest was or even how that word had come to be. And so I asked my friend who ran the pipe ceremony, and he laughed in my face. "God wants you to go on a vision quest, eh? Well, you're screwed," he said. And by the way, some friends of mine are running a quest in 2 weeks. Now, the vision quest, as it was described to me, was the Creator's gift to his children. Many First Nations practice this sacred ceremony of sending their youth alone into the woods to spend time with God and to return with a vision for their lives. In writing about the experience, Caitlin B. Curtis said, "A vision quest draws a person deeper inside himself and at the same time allows him to look at himself from the outside. So much does a person learn in the process that in many tribes it's thought to be essential for the proper evolution of a healthy life path." The vision quest, as I experienced it, was all of that and more. It was like 2 years of therapy packed into 4 intense days. Fasting alone in the woods without food, tent, or other material distractions left me no choice but to take a look at the invisible baggage that I carried around with me everywhere. It was cathartic. It was freeing. It was transformative, and all the while I felt like I was being held by God, who so clearly loved me enough to prune as well as cultivate. And I was so grateful to the Spirit who had driven me into the wilderness that on the last day, and many of you have heard this story, I blurted out, "Thank you, Creator. Please, what can I do for you?" And I looked up as a hawk flew overhead, and a voice said, "Be a minister." Now, that gift was so precious and fragile that at first I didn't tell anyone what I'd heard. After all, I didn't even go to church. How could I be a minister? And when I first heard God say, "Be a minister," I thought that one of us had gone crazy. You meant a minstrel, right, God? A minstrel? It was clear to me that the life I had known was over. I would have to go back to school for 7.5 years. I'd have to give up the fantasy of ever winning an Oscar. I would have to face the prejudices I had about church people, who I thought were all Bible-thumping zealots or boring hypocrites. And I waited. until I'd nurtured the seeds of the vision quest and they'd become deeply rooted before telling anyone what I'd heard. Because I didn't know how to explain this sudden shift in my life without people trying to discredit the experience I had in the wilderness. That was 16 years ago. Indisputably, the best 16 years of my life have been the last 16. Who knew that God knew me better than I knew myself? Caitlin B. Curtis grew up learning the negative side of Jesus in the wilderness, the story of Satan who tries to destroy anyone who ventures out alone. Beware, that story says. But later in life, she began to explore the spiritual teachings of the Potawatomi elders that are her tradition. And just as Jesus cleansed himself through baptism before following the Spirit into the wilderness, her ancestors smudged before entering into the sacred vision quest ceremony. Unlike Luke, the elders of her tradition lifted up the gifts of the wilderness, which they saw as essential and life-giving. The wilderness was ultimately a place of vision, not temptation. A story about God's love, not the devil's weakness. In the struggle with temptation, in the silence of the wilderness, in the company of the angels, Jesus found himself, his voice, his vocation. Gone was the carpenter's son, and in his place stood the Christ. This Lent, we can walk the well-worn detour to Good Friday, or we can follow Jesus into the contemplative wilderness where God and vision are found. And God will journey with us no matter which path we choose. But with a fine traveling companion at our side, why would we not choose the path to new life? I'll see you in the wilderness. Amen.